So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Mashiach laid waste for many centuries. As we read it in Yeshayahu the prophet, then we find the layer related with the time of the restoration period. That's the time where then we are experiencing a huge transition from what was during the time of the New World Order, and then the time we are then rescuing what used to be back then. So, based from the description of the completion of the spring feast, the spring feast is then the Hebrew Moadim. Known then in Vayikra, the 23rd chapter, you find the section of the year, a completion of a number of holy feasts, or then rehearsals for the time then of the coming of the Hamashiach ben Yosef, and obviously he was similar as Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Amos, Daniel, Ezekiel. These were then the prophets, Yod-He Vav-He, in his condition of Galah, or then revelator, reveal to these men then the understandings of the time of his coming. So then the Torah was going to be clean, and also the time of the autumn, where then the end of the world would then be explained. Prior of the time of the end at Yom Kippur, we find then there is a step of formation regarding then the nations. They are coming together, and then later on going against the holy city. Always in the scripture there are the steps of formation. It's not understandings randomly picked. There are always understandings prior of this time. Prior of the time of the restoration period, there are steps of formation. Prior of Yom Kippur, there are the steps of formation of the restoration. Prior of this New World Order, had then the time of the Hamashiach ben Yosef, where then people were then simply understanding the Torah and the prophets. So when we understand the time of the restoration, simply means the time where then Daniel had mentioned regarding then the layer. Then later on the Hamashiach ben Yosef said, let those who hear understand it. And then the increase of knowledge, the understanding of trade. Daniel was extremely important because he used to work for the king of Babylon. So then when we read Daniel, the first understanding is where Daniel is coming from. Is he coming from tabernacling explanations or from the Gentile explanation of the future, regarding kingdoms of the future? So Daniel mostly was a prophet on behalf of the Gentile kingdom, though he did explain a few sections related with tabernacling. Most of his life he spent dealing with the kingdoms of this world. Ezekiel, however, had spent much of his time speaking of tabernacling. So, reading from Yeshayahu, the 23rd chapter in the 9th verse, you find then the restoration of what was during the time of the 1,000 years of the Hamashiach ben Yosef, and what he explained on on behalf of Yod-He Vav-He, the revealer or Galah. You find that during this period, the presence of Yod-He Vav-He was extremely strong, and people were led by the Spirit. Later on, the situation reversed. Then became known in roughly 1009. Then the Muslims, they destroyed the holy city, and they made a declaration that they want in a certain way. They want their own world order. That's when then the Nahashatan, known then by various names, he then changed from destroyer into mockery. You have to understand the Hebrew text and understand the facets, so then we can make a transition while you are reading. These are basic understandings of the functions of Yod-He Vav-He and the functions of Nahashatan. And obviously they are contrary with each other. So during this time, when we read Yeshayahu, the 23rd chapter and the 9th verse, try to understand, in the Hebrew manuscript there is no chapter, neither verse. You have to understand by layers. You have to understand what content is being spoken of, and then you have to layer with the rest of them. So you have the entire line of understanding from point A to point B. So, regarding then the 23rd chapter of Yeshayahu the prophet, then you find very precisely explains then, and the crowning of whose merchants are the chief traders, then are these then the honor of the earth? Then he explains that he's going then to put to shame their contempt, because for a long time they have not honored the ways spoken of and explained by the previous influence of the Spirit. Because nations, they have lied, they have cheated, they have done wrongly, they have murdered. So the New World Order was a disaster. When we understand the scripture and the standards, the Yod-He Vav-He in His holy presence, His divinity, should request obviously certain standards, and unfortunately they neglected His standards and did whatever they wanted, and during this time it was obviously very shameful. So the restoration period explains why then He is restoring of what was then more than 1,000 years ago. So then, because of these, then gives you a prelude of what system Daniel is explaining. Daniel, obviously, he was very influential during his time. In fact, he lived roughly 500 years before the coming of the last great prophet, the Hamashiach ben Yosef, and he simply was explaining sections for the preparation of his coming, and then for the final combat at the autumn feast. So Daniel gives us a very important structuring. So then later in the future we would read his prophecies and would understand not only from Daniel but from Ezekiel and from Amos and from Daniel and then from Hamashiach ben Yosef. And these not only the documents ever found. There are thousands of other documents, and those are also, as long as they are aligned with the Torah, with the prophets, valid scripture. So, reading from the time of Daniel, Daniel was a minister of finances. If you study very precisely, during the time Daniel was giving his services, you find that his responsibility was dealing with other nations in bringing the wealth from trade with Babylon, and he was then a person related with the monetary systems, related with the credit lines, related with the debits, related with lending money, receiving money, and an interest. He was very much in tune with the system of Babylon and the government related with the nations around him. So very wisely, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh created an understanding of a system around Daniel. It wasn't Daniel doing the work, it was Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh from behind, but Daniel was his representative on how trade should be conducted. Later on, when Hamashiach ben Yosef came and began to explain what was spoken previously, then people began to adopt what Daniel had lived trade-wise, and then they began to prosper. But then the prospering went into their heads. As usual, when people get a lot of money, they get screwed up. Roughly 9 out of 10, they get screwed up with power and prestige and influence. And in scores of time, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, remind yourself where you came from. So then, reading from the time of the restoration period, Daniel was explaining later on a knowledge would increase for the purposes of trade. Many times this was spoken. Obviously you have other kinds of knowledges that have increased. But what Daniel is pointing is there is a system related with trade. So then what Daniel was doing during his time would be greatly multiplied in the future, and a quality with a divine presence. This means a person should not cheat, should not lie doing trade, should be faithful, should be honest, and act with integrity. These are then the divine traits that should be exercised while then the transition from the New World Order that was an absolute disaster and ended in 08-09, and then the restoring of these traits of the divine, but then because of the usage of computers are very precise, and as long as they do properly, if the computer is set properly, it's very exacting. It does not let you steal. It does not let you becoming out of standard. So then this increases the trade tremendously, because proper wealth are properly dispersed, and then people can do what they should be doing. Honesty, integrity, doing things as per then a certain standard that was exercised more than 1,000 years ago. That's why the nations are in uproar. They don't know what to do. Certain trades that were exercised for decades, and then in a very short time they nearly have half of what they were used to make. So the transitional time, and there is a second transition yet coming. Daniel gives us a few understandings of the first transition, and then there is a second transition yet. China is then becoming the new world power because of the huge amount of trade, and because the usage of computers and computer systems, and people are purchasing via internet a whole lot more than ever in the history of this world. So then later on, when you read Revelation known as Golah, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Golah, his revelations of the prelude prior of the Yom Kippur, the final combat, you find then that these merchants are the most important bunch of this world. If you read Yod He Vav He Galah, or Revelation, you find then very precisely the content of these holy instructions. They do not talk of kingdoms anymore. They talk of merchants. So you understand the transition that were then based from government and then into trade. The power during the time of the king of Babylon, the head of gold, the main power was not with the king. The main power was with Daniel. The king had the final word. But Yod He Vav He, in his function, his divine function, was then placing Daniel in his ability of doing then the work of trade. And Daniel obviously had liberty to bring in these wealth, and obviously the king was satisfied with his services. So Daniel then is explaining that later in the future, a system precisely as he was doing because he was under the influence of the divine is going to be exercised in the future. However, this exercise is going to be then greatly increased. And the computer does it because it's very precise, very succinct, and gives you then the proper understanding of payment and receiving, and people then can buy and trade and do the things that they should be doing. So then the 23rd chapter of Yeshayahu gives us then a few understandings. That's not every situation included, but again shows you the prelude that we are experiencing until the main Chinese system then is revealed. We already have a few understandings of this system. We have a few companies in the world that are extremely big, and they are using the internet as a means of exchange. And then you have also the layer of investment that's not yet publicized. So there is yet a chunk of information coming related with the system. So then, Daniel the 11th chapter is obviously the structuring we should be concerned with, read, and make a map of the political, trade, tabernacling, military. So each of those contents can be layered based from the content you are reading. That's why when you are reading then Yeshayahu the prophet, you can't say that chapter 5 then comes before the 6, because you do not know the content. You have sections, for instance, as an example only, 5 related with the 61st. You have the 50th related with the 45th. That's why in the Hebrew manuscript there are no numbers as far as chapters and verses. So later on I'm going to explain more of this section related with Galah, and then the merchants of the earth, and why then they are so powerful. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.